Hello, and welcome to History at Night. Before we begin tonight, I just want to take a quiet moment to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for trusting this channel with your evenings, your late nights, your restless hours. Every comment, every kind word, every person who shares these videos with someone who needs a little peace at the end of the day, that means more than I can say. Tonight, we are going somewhere extraordinary. We are going back further than almost any civilization on Earth, back to a land of golden sand and black earth, of mighty rivers and silent stone. We are going to Egypt, 3,000 years of history, of kings and collapse, of gods and forgotten tombs. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Before there were pyramids, before there were pharaohs, before there was even a word for Egypt, there was only the river. It moved slowly through one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. On either side of it, the desert stretched without mercy, pale, brutal, timeless. But along its banks, something extraordinary happened. Every year, without fail, the river rose. It flooded its banks in a gentle, deliberate surge, and when it pulled back, it left behind a thin ribbon of dark, rich earth. That soil was unlike anything else in the ancient world. In a land of almost no rainfall, in a continent where survival was a daily negotiation with the sun, that narrow strip of black earth was life itself. The ancient Egyptians called it Kemet, the Black Land, and they called the desert Deshret, the Red Land. These two worlds existed side by side, separated by only a few hundred meters in some places, a boundary as sharp as a knife's edge. On one side, everything that lived. On the other, everything that died. The river, of course, was the Nile, and for the people who gathered along its banks somewhere around 10,000 years ago, it was not simply a geographical feature. It was the reason for everything. It was the source, the pulse, the great organizing principle around which all of human life would arrange itself for millennia to come. The earliest settlers here were not builders of stone. They were farmers and herders who had drifted in from the Sahara as that great landscape dried and contracted over thousands of years. They brought with them their animals, their seeds, their knowledge of the seasons. They learned to read the river the way other people read the sky, watching for the signs of the annual flood, planting in the wet soil left behind, harvesting before the next inundation came. They built small mud brick villages. They buried their dead in shallow graves at the edge of the desert, oriented toward the setting sun, surrounded by the small objects they had loved in life. Pots painted with spiraling designs, ivory combs, beads of carnelian and turquoise. These were not yet Egyptians in any formal sense. They were something older and simpler, people learning to live with a river that gave and took in equal measure. But something was changing in the centuries between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. The villages were growing, trade was moving up and down the river, distinctive art styles were spreading, leaders were emerging, men and women who could organize the labor of planting and harvesting, who could coordinate the building of irrigation channels, who could settle the disputes that inevitably arose when people lived close together. By around 3,500 BCE, something resembling organized kingdoms had emerged in the Nile Valley. Archaeologists call them the pre-dynastic cultures, named after the Egyptian sites where their remains were first discovered. In Upper Egypt, the long southern stretch of the Nile, one tradition dominated. In Lower Egypt, the broad delta, where the river fans out into the Mediterranean, another tradition flourished. These two regions would define Egyptian civilization for the next 3,000 years, and the tension and unity between them would be one of its great recurring themes. The story of how they became one kingdom is told in fragments of pottery and carved palettes, and a handful of inscriptions so early that scholars still argue about what they mean. The most famous of these is a carved ceremonial object called the Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis in 1898. On one side, a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt strikes down a kneeling enemy. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt and inspects the decapitated bodies of his foes. The king's name, written in the earliest form of Egyptian hieroglyphics, is Narmer. Whether Nama was a real historical figure who single-handedly unified Egypt, or whether he was one of several kings over several generations who gradually brought the two lands together, is a question that still produces lively debate among Egyptologists. What is not in doubt is that around 3100 BCE, Egypt emerged as a unified state. A single king ruled the length of the Nile, from the cataracts in the south to the delta in the north. He wore two crowns, one for each land. He was called Lord of the Two Lands, and the civilization that grew from this unification would become one of the most enduring in human history. The first pharaohs ruled from a city called Memphis, built at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, at the point where the Nile Valley narrows before opening into the delta. Memphis was a calculated choice, a capital that could command both worlds. Around it, the first administrative structures of the Egyptian state began to take shape. Scribes recorded the movements of grain. Officials oversaw the building of temples. Priests performed the rituals that kept the gods appeased and the river flowing. And already, even in these earliest years, the Egyptians were developing something that would distinguish their civilization from almost every other: a profound and elaborate engagement with the idea of death, not as an ending, but as a passage, not as something to be feared, but as something to be prepared for, with great care and extraordinary expense. The earliest royal tombs were rectangular mud brick structures called mastabas, from the Arabic word for bench, because that is what they resembled from the outside. But what lay beneath was increasingly complex. A series of underground chambers meant to house the body and the possessions the dead king would need in the next world. The Egyptians believed, with a certainty that seems almost impossible to us now, that life continued after death, that the spirit of a person could return to its body, that the soul, the ka, needed its physical home in order to survive eternity. This belief would reshape the landscape of Egypt more dramatically than anything else in its history, and the first great expression of it came not long after unification, during the reign of a king named Djoser. Djoser ruled sometime around 2650 BCE, in the period Egyptologists call the Old Kingdom. His reign was not remarkable for war or conquest. What made Djoser extraordinary was his architect, a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was, by any measure, a genius. He served as the king's chief official and high priest, and at some point he proposed something that had never been done before. Instead of building a flat mastaba of mud brick, he would build the king's tomb in stone, and instead of a single flat layer, he would stack one mastaba on top of another, each slightly smaller than the one below, rising in a series of steps toward the sky. The result was the step pyramid of Saqqara, and it still stands today. 6 steps rising to a height of about 60 meters, the first large stone structure ever built anywhere on Earth. It was surrounded by a vast complex of temples and courts, all constructed from limestone blocks, all oriented toward the stars and the rising sun. Standing at Saqqara today, looking up at that stepped profile against the desert sky, it is almost impossible not to feel something. A recognition, perhaps, that the people who built this were not so different from us, that they looked at the same sky and wondered the same things. What happens after we die? Is there something beyond the horizon of this world? The step pyramid inspired the pharaohs who followed Djoser to go further, to build higher, to reach more completely for something eternal. And within a century of Imhotep's great experiment at Saqqara, the results were astonishing. The 4th dynasty of Egypt, which began around 2613 BCE, produced the greatest concentration of monumental building in human history. In the space of roughly 100 years, on a plateau of limestone west of Memphis, 3 men built structures that the world is still talking about 4,500 years later. The first was Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. His pyramid at Giza is the largest stone building ever constructed. It originally rose to a height of about 146 meters, a figure that remained the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. with some blocks near the base weighing as much as 80 tons. The precision with which those blocks were cut and laid is still, genuinely, a matter of scientific discussion. The base of Khufu's pyramid covers an area of about 53,000 square meters and is level to within 2.1 centimeters in a desert, without modern surveying equipment, without steel or machinery, without GPS. How they did it is one of the great questions of archaeology, and the honest answer is that we do not know exactly. What we do know from the papyrus records of a man named Mira, discovered in 2013, the oldest papyrus documents ever found, is that the workers who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were organized teams of paid workers, skilled craftsmen, doctors, administrators, bakers who made bread for the laborers, fishermen who provided protein. There was a hospital near the pyramid complex where injured workers received care. The scale of the logistical operation is staggering. This was not the work of a tyrant driving the desperate. It was the coordinated effort of an enormously capable state. After Khufu came Khafre, whose pyramid at Giza is nearly as large and whose funerary complex includes the Great Sphinx, a limestone figure carved from a natural rock outcrop, with the body of a lion and the face, most Egyptologists believe, of Khafre himself. The Sphinx sits at the edge of the Giza plateau and stares east, toward the rising sun, its gaze fixed on the horizon where day begins and ends, where the cycle of death and rebirth plays out eternally. And after Khafre came Menkaure, whose pyramid is smaller, but whose craftsmanship, particularly in the surviving statuary, is arguably the finest of the three. By the time Menkaure's pyramid was complete, the Pyramid Age was essentially over. Not because the Egyptians stopped building pyramids, they didn't, but because the sheer resources required to maintain this level of construction were beginning to strain even the considerable capacity of the Egyptian state. The Old Kingdom lasted until around 2181 BCE, a period of roughly 400 years, during which Egypt was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful and sophisticated civilization on Earth. Its administrators governed effectively. Its artists created work of extraordinary beauty and skill. Its scribes developed one of the world's great writing systems, and its priests maintained an elaborate theology that explained the universe in terms both comforting and precise. But civilizations, even great ones, are vulnerable, and the Old Kingdom's vulnerability came from a direction no army could defend against. The Nile floods were the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Too little flood, and the crops failed. Too much, and the fields were destroyed. The balance was narrow, and for centuries the balance had held. But around 2200 BCE, something shifted. The climate changed. The floods grew unreliable. In some years, the river barely rose at all, and the fields that depended on its silt turned to cracked, baking earth. In other years, catastrophic floods swept away everything. The result was famine, and famine, in a civilization as centralized and dependent on grain as Egypt, was existential. The central government, which derived its legitimacy partly from its ability to regulate the distribution of food, found itself unable to feed its people. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, began to act independently, managing their own resources and building their own power bases. The elaborate bureaucracy that had kept Egypt running began to fracture along its fault lines. Around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed. What followed was a period Egyptologists call the First Intermediate Period, and it was, by Egyptian standards, a time of profound disorder. The country fragmented into competing regional powers. The great royal workshops fell silent. Art became local and inconsistent. Texts from this period speak of starvation, of bodies unburied, of the social order overturned. A document known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, written sometime during or after this period, describes a world turned upside down, where the poor have become rich and the rich have become poor, where the fields lie unworked and the river is full of blood. Whether the Admonitions is a literal account or a literary exercise in the genre of lament is debated. but its tone captures something true about the first intermediate period. It was a time when Egyptians confronted, perhaps for the first time, the possibility that their world was not eternal, that the order they had taken for granted could be taken away. It took roughly 2 centuries, but Egypt eventually reassembled itself. The rulers of Thebes, a city far to the south in Upper Egypt, gradually extended their control northward, reunifying the country around 2055 BCE. The man credited with this reunification was Mentuhotep II, who ruled for half a century and who would later be regarded as the founder of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's second great era of civilization. The Middle Kingdom is often described as the classical age of Egyptian literature, and for good reason. The texts produced during this period, roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, include some of the most sophisticated writing in the ancient world. The story of Sinuhe tells of an Egyptian official who flees to Canaan after overhearing news of the king's death and builds a new life abroad, only to long always for home. It is a story of identity and belonging, of the pull of one's origins that feels entirely modern. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor is a layered fantasy of adventure and wonder. The eloquent peasant is a series of passionate speeches about justice and the obligations of power. These were not texts written for the archives. They were read aloud, copied, memorized, and enjoyed. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also pushed Egypt's borders outward. They campaigned in Nubia to the south, establishing a series of powerful fortresses along the Nile to control the trade in gold and exotic goods that came from the African interior. They sent expeditions to Punt, a land that probably lay somewhere along the Horn of Africa, returning with myrrh trees, frankincense, ebony, and leopard skins. They traded with the cities of the Levant and the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Middle Kingdom, like the Old Kingdom before it, eventually ran into trouble. The process was more gradual this time, a slow weakening rather than a sudden collapse. The later pharaohs of the period were less forceful. Provincial power reasserted itself. And around 1650 BCE, Egypt's borders were breached for the first time by a foreign power. The people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, a word meaning something like rulers of foreign lands, had been filtering into the Nile Delta from Canaan for generations, gradually settling and building their own communities. Now, taking advantage of Egypt's weakened central authority, they established their own kingdom in the Delta, ruling from a city called Avaris. It was a shock to the Egyptian sense of themselves. Egypt was the greatest civilization on earth. Egypt did not submit to foreigners, and yet here were foreign kings sitting on an Egyptian throne. The Hyksos were not savage conquerors. They adopted Egyptian customs, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own, and administered Egypt in a manner not entirely unlike their Egyptian predecessors. They also introduced technologies that Egypt had not previously possessed: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and new types of bronze weapons. These innovations would matter enormously when Egyptians eventually rose to drive them out. The expulsion of the Hyksos was accomplished by a series of Theban kings, of whom the most important was Ahmose I, who came to the throne around 1550 BCE and pursued the Hyksos all the way back into Canaan. Ahmose's victory was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological one. Egypt had faced an existential threat, absorbed it, learned from it, and emerged stronger and more aggressive than before. The period that followed is the one that lives most vividly in the imagination when ancient Egypt is mentioned. The New Kingdom, lasting from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, was Egypt at its most powerful, its most expansive, and, in many ways, its most fascinating. It produced the pharaohs whose names have traveled across 3,000 years to reach us: Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, Ramesses. These are the figures of legend, and the civilization they presided over was genuinely extraordinary. The New Kingdom began with a military energy born of the Hyksos expulsion. The pharaohs of the early New Kingdom understood, as perhaps no previous Egyptian ruler had, that Egypt's security required a buffer zone. The wars of the Hyksos period had demonstrated that Egypt's eastern border was permeable. So the new kings pushed that border further and further into Asia, campaigning in Canaan, Syria, and eventually reaching as far as the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. Egypt became an empire. Among the most remarkable of these early pharaohs was a woman. Hatshepsut came to the throne around 1473 BCE as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but she quickly moved beyond the role of regent and declared herself pharaoh in her own right. She is depicted in her monuments wearing the double crown, the false beard that was the symbol of kingship, and the ceremonial dress of a male pharaoh. She ruled for roughly 20 years, and by any measure, her reign was a success. She sent a famous trading expedition to Punt, which returned with living myrrh trees that she planted in the gardens of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. She built on a grand scale. She sent armies to suppress trouble in Nubia. She was, by any reasonable standard, one of the most capable rulers in Egyptian history. After her death, her successor, Thutmose III, spent years systematically erasing her name from her monuments, chiseling out her cartouches, and replacing them with his own. Whether this was because he resented her usurpation of what he considered his rightful throne, or because it was done late in his reign for other, more practical reasons of succession, is still debated. But it did not entirely succeed. Hatshepsut's image survived in enough places that 19th century archaeologists were eventually able to piece together her story. Thutmose III, once he was able to rule in his own right, proved to be one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. In a series of 17 campaigns into Asia, he extended Egypt's empire to its greatest geographical extent. He was a careful administrator, as well as a brilliant commander, and he left Egypt considerably richer and more powerful than he found it. The empire reached its peak under Amenhotep III, who ruled from roughly 1388 to 1351 BCE. His reign was one of extraordinary luxury and artistic achievement. He built on a scale that rivaled even the pyramid builders, constructing temples at Thebes so large that the later pharaoh, Ramesses II, would incorporate their columns wholesale into his own buildings. His palace at Malkata was enormous, furnished with faience tiles and painted walls, equipped with its own harbour on the Nile. The international correspondence of his reign, preserved in a cache of clay tablets found at a site called Amarna in the 19th century, reveals a world of sophisticated diplomatic exchange. Egyptian gold flowed outward in exchange for horses, lapis lazuli, and the daughters of foreign kings. But it was Amenhotep III's son who would shake Egypt to its foundations. Amenhotep IV came to the throne around 1351 BCE, and for the first few years of his reign seemed unremarkable. And then, gradually at first, and then, with accelerating intensity, he did something that had never been done before and would never be done again. He attempted to abolish Egypt's entire traditional religion and replace it with the worship of a single god. The god he chose was the Aten, the solar disk, not the sun god Ra, who had been worshipped for millennia as one of Egypt's greatest deities, but the disk of the sun itself, the physical light that warmed the earth. He changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning one who is effective for the Aten. He built an entirely new capital city in the desert, on a stretch of virgin ground in Middle Egypt, and called it Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. We know it today by its Arabic name, Amarna. At Amarna, Akhenaten presided over a revolution in art as well as religion. The stiff, formal conventions of Egyptian art, which had remained essentially unchanged for 1500 years, were replaced by something startling in its naturalism. Royal figures were shown in intimate, informal poses, a king kissing his daughter, a queen sitting on her husband's knee, children playing, people eating. And the figures themselves were strange, elongated, with long skulls and swelling bellies and heavy thighs that bear no resemblance to the idealized perfection of traditional Egyptian art. Whether this was a genuine new aesthetic vision, a stylistic convention reflecting a theological idea that the royal family embodied divine fullness, or something else entirely, is a question that has occupied art historians for generations. Akhenaten's physical appearance in these images has fueled endless speculation. Was he simply represented in a new artistic style? Did he suffer from some medical condition? Was the elongated head a deliberate theological statement? The answers remain elusive. What is not in dispute is that Akhenaten's religious revolution was real and radical. He ordered the names of the traditional gods, especially Amun, chiseled from monuments across Egypt. He closed the great temples. He redirected the enormous wealth and labor that had supported the traditional priesthood to the worship of the Aten alone. For the ordinary Egyptian, this must have been deeply disorienting. The gods they had prayed to since childhood, the deities who governed every aspect of life from birth to death, were suddenly gone, declared non-existent by the man whose word was law. And while Akhenaten's gaze was fixed on theology, other things were unraveling. The Amarna letters reveal a stream of desperate appeals from Egypt's allies and vassals in Asia, begging for Egyptian troops to help them against the advancing Hittites. The replies from Akhenaten are vague, delayed, or absent. Whether this was because the king was genuinely distracted by his religious vision, or because the letters represent only part of a more active foreign policy, is debated. But the impression given by the correspondence is of an empire beginning to fray at the edges. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years and then disappeared from the historical record. Exactly how he died is unknown. What followed was a period of rapid royal succession and deliberate counter-revolution. His religion was abandoned. His city was left to the desert sands. His name was systematically erased from the monuments. He became the heretic pharaoh, his very existence denied for more than 3,000 years. Among those who followed Akhenaten in quick succession was a young boy who came to the throne with the name Tutankhaten and changed it to Tutankhamun, moving back to the old capital, reopening the temples, restoring the traditional gods. He died young, probably around 18 or 19 years old, without leaving an heir, and was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Because of his brief reign and his relative insignificance by the grand standards of Egyptian history, his tomb was eventually forgotten, covered over by the rubble from a later tomb excavated nearby. It was found intact by the British archaeologist Howard Carter in November 1922. And what he found inside changed our understanding of Egyptian royal burial forever. Nested coffins of gold, a funerary mask of beaten gold that is perhaps the most recognized image from the ancient world. Room after room of furniture, weapons, jewelry, chariots, clothing, and ritual objects. If a minor pharaoh who ruled for only a decade was buried with this kind of wealth, what must the tombs of the great pharaohs have contained? We will never entirely know, because every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, some within decades of the burial. The treasures of Ramesses II, of Seti I, of Thutmose III are simply gone. After the turbulence of the Amarna period, Egypt reasserted itself under a new dynasty, the 19th, which produced one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, Ramesses II. Ramesses came to the throne around 1279 BCE and ruled for an astonishing 66 years, outliving many of his own sons. He was, above all, a builder. The temples he constructed or embellished span the entire length of Egypt and extend deep into Nubia. The great temple of Abu Simbel, carved directly into a cliff face above the Nile in what is now Sudan, features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each 20 meters tall, flanking the entrance to a sanctuary aligned so that twice a year, at dawn on the dates of his supposed birthday and coronation, the rising sun penetrates the inner sanctuary and illuminates 3 of the 4 statues at the back wall. The 4th, a figure of Ptah, the god of darkness, remains always in shadow. Ramesses was also a warrior. Early in his reign, he fought one of the most famous battles of the ancient world at a place called Kadesh in modern Syria, against the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The battle was, in military terms, roughly a draw. Both sides fought to exhaustion and then withdrew, but Ramesses turned it into a propaganda triumph of the First Order. covering the walls of his temples from Thebes to Abu Simbel with detailed accounts of his personal heroism on the battlefield. In these images, Ramesses stands in his chariot, drawing his bow, arrows flying from his hands, the Hittites retreating in terror before him. The poem of Pentor, which describes the battle, was carved so many times on so many walls that it is the most widely reproduced text from the ancient world. What followed Kadesh was remarkable in a different way. Around 1259 BCE, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace treaty, the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world. Both sides agreed to mutual respect, extradition of political refugees, and military assistance against third parties. A copy of the treaty hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of humanity's long history of attempting to resolve conflicts through diplomacy. Ramesses ruled long enough to see himself become a god in his own lifetime. He was worshipped at temples in Nubia while he was still alive, a rare distinction even for an Egyptian king. When he finally died, around 1213 BCE, he left behind a transformed landscape, a testament in stone to human ambition that still astonishes today. His mummified body was found in 1881, one of dozens of royal mummies recovered from a cache in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, where they had been placed by priests of the 21st dynasty to protect them from tomb robbers. He rests today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. In 1974, when it was noticed that the mummy was deteriorating, Ramesses was issued an Egyptian passport, his occupation listed as king, deceased, and flown to Paris, where he was received with full military honors, as protocol requires for any visiting head of state, and treated for a fungal infection. He then returned to Cairo. After Ramesses II, Egypt began a long, slow descent. Not a dramatic collapse like the end of the Old Kingdom, but a gradual erosion, a steady loss of the energy and coherence that had made Egypt great. His immediate successors were capable enough, but the 19th dynasty ended in dynastic confusion around 1189 BCE. The 20th dynasty that followed was dominated by a series of kings who all took the name Ramesses, none of them as capable as the original. The third of these later Ramesside kings, Ramesses III, faced perhaps the most dramatic threat Egypt had ever confronted. Around 1177 BCE, a mysterious coalition of peoples, whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, descended on the eastern Mediterranean world with devastating effect. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's great rival, was destroyed. The palace cities of the Aegean world collapsed. Cyprus was overrun. The Sea Peoples swept down the Levantine coast and attacked Egypt itself. Ramesses III repelled them, in land and sea battles commemorated in graphic detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The reliefs show fierce naval battles in the Nile Delta, Egyptian archers shooting from the shore while sailors fight hand-to-hand on the decks. The Sea Peoples, identified by their distinctive feathered headdresses and their varied origins from what may have been multiple regions of the Mediterranean world, were driven back, but Egypt emerged from the crisis weakened. The economy was under strain. The administrative apparatus was becoming unwieldy. Corruption was spreading through the bureaucracy. Workers on the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina recorded, in documents that still survive, the first documented labor strike in history, walking off the job because their grain rations had not been delivered. The pharaoh's ability to maintain the basic social contract, to feed the people in exchange for their labor, was faltering. After Ramesses III, Egypt lost its remaining territories in Asia. Nubia slipped away. The country fragmented into competing power bases in the north and the south. The high priests of Amun at Thebes became so powerful that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt independently, while a line of kings ruled in the delta. The two lands, which had been unified for 1500 years, were divided again. This was the end of the new kingdom and the beginning of a long twilight. The period that followed, from roughly 1070 to 664 BCE, is sometimes called the Third Intermediate Period, and it is extraordinarily complex. Egypt was repeatedly invaded and ruled by foreigners, the Libyans, who had been settling in the delta for generations, eventually produced a dynasty of pharaohs who ruled from the city of Bubastis. Nubian kings from the south swept into Egypt around 747 BCE and established the 25th dynasty, reunifying the country under rulers who were, paradoxically, in many ways more traditionally Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, commissioning statues and inscriptions in archaic Old Kingdom styles as a deliberate statement of cultural restoration. Then came the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire, based in what is now northern Iraq, was the most militarily powerful state in the ancient world in the 7th century BCE. Their armies swept across the Middle East in campaigns of methodical brutality, leaving a trail of deportations and destruction that is recorded in both their own annals and the texts of their victims. Around 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt and captured Memphis. Around 663 BCE, his successor Ashurbanipal sacked Thebes, the spiritual heart of Egypt, a city so ancient and magnificent that the Greek poet Homer would describe it as the city of 100 gates. The desecration of Thebes was experienced by Egyptians as a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension, but the Assyrians, though they conquered Egypt, were not able to hold it. Their empire was too large, their resources stretched too thin. They withdrew, leaving behind client rulers in the delta. One of these client rulers, a man named Psamtik of the city of Sais, seized the opportunity. He gradually reunified Egypt, driving out the remaining Assyrian influence, and founded the 26th dynasty, known to history as the Saite period. The Saite pharaohs presided over one of Egypt's final flowerings. They were enthusiastic patrons of the arts and sponsored a deliberate revival of ancient styles, looking back to the Old Kingdom as a golden age. Their sculptors created works of extraordinary technical refinement. Their architects restored ancient temples. They opened Egypt to Greek merchants and mercenaries, establishing a trading colony at Naucratis in the delta that became a bridge between the ancient world of Egypt and the newer world of the Greek city-states. Greek writers, including Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE and wrote extensively about it in his histories, were fascinated by this ancient civilization and did much to transmit Egyptian ideas and stories to the wider world. But the Saite revival was ultimately fragile. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt and conquered it with surprising ease. Egypt became a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had yet seen. The Persians ruled Egypt with varying degrees of success and legitimacy, presenting themselves as successors of the pharaohs in some contexts and simple conquerors in others. There were periods of Persian rule, periods of Egyptian revolt, periods of reunification, each more complicated than the last. And then, in 332 BCE, everything changed again. Alexander of Macedon was 23 years old when he arrived in Egypt. He had already defeated the Persian Empire's armies at the battles of Granicus and Issus and taken much of the Levant. The Persian satrap of Egypt, rather than fight a battle he could not win, surrendered the country without resistance. The Egyptians did not experience Alexander as a conqueror. They experienced him as a liberator from the Persians, who were genuinely resented. Alexander was careful to present himself in Egyptian terms, traveling to the oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa in the western desert, where the oracle reportedly addressed him as the son of Amun, giving him a divine legitimacy that no Persian ruler had claimed. He was crowned pharaoh, performing the traditional rituals, wearing the traditional garments, before he left Egypt to continue his campaigns in the east. Alexander laid out the plan for a new city at the western edge of the Nile Delta, where a narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean offered a perfect site for a harbour. He called it Alexandria. He never saw it completed. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, and his generals fought over the pieces of his empire. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, who eventually declared himself king and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of rulers who would govern Egypt for the next 3 centuries. They were Macedonian Greeks who ruled a country that was ancient and sophisticated and deeply set in its ways. The Ptolemies were, in the main, extremely capable rulers. They adopted the title of pharaoh, built and restored Egyptian temples on a grand scale, worshipped Egyptian gods, and presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects in traditional terms. To their Greek and Macedonian subjects, they were Hellenistic kings in the Greek tradition. This double identity was maintained with considerable skill across many generations. The Great Temple at Dendera, with its famous ceiling map of the night sky and its carvings of the Ptolemaic rulers in full pharaonic regalia, is as beautiful and as thoroughly Egyptian in spirit as anything built during the New Kingdom. Alexandria itself became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The Museum and the Library of Alexandria, founded under Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, gathered scholars from across the Greek-speaking world. Euclid worked here and laid the foundations of geometry. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using a stick and the geometry of shadows. Archimedes, though he worked in Syracuse, visited Alexandria. The poet Callimachus catalogued the library's holdings. The astronomer Aristarchus proposed, 17 centuries before Copernicus, that the Earth orbited the Sun. The Ptolemaic period was also the period during which much of what the ancient world knew about Egypt was organized and transmitted. The priest Manetho, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, compiled a history of Egyptian pharaohs organized into dynasties, a framework still used by Egyptologists today. Egyptian hieroglyphics continued to be carved on temple walls, but the script was becoming increasingly esoteric, known only to a small priestly class. The ordinary language of administration was now Greek, over time Demotic, a shorthand descendant of hieratic, which was itself a cursive form of hieroglyphics, served as the language of everyday documents. But the Ptolemaic dynasty was not immune to the problems that had afflicted every Egyptian dynasty before it. Succession disputes, court intrigue, and the growing power of Rome all contributed to a slow erosion of Ptolemaic authority. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt was essentially a client state of Rome, dependent on Roman support to maintain any independence at all. The last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was Cleopatra VII. She is perhaps the most famous woman in the ancient world, and yet almost everything the popular imagination associates with her is at best simplified and at worst wrong. She was not Egyptian by birth, but Macedonian Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy I. She was the first member of her dynasty in nearly 3 centuries to bother learning the Egyptian language, and she reportedly spoke 9 languages in total, which tells you something about her formidable intelligence. She was not primarily famous for her appearance, though ancient sources do comment on her presence and her voice. She was famous, in antiquity, for her mind. Cleopatra came to the throne around 51 BCE in partnership with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she was expected to marry, as was the tradition of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The arrangement broke down almost immediately into a power struggle, and Cleopatra was eventually forced from Egypt by her brother's advisors. She raised an army and was preparing to fight her way back when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE, pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled there after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. The story of how Cleopatra arranged to meet Caesar privately, supposedly smuggled to him in a rolled carpet or a linen sack to avoid the agents of her brother, is told by the ancient biographer Plutarch. What happened next is that Cleopatra secured Caesar's support. Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt with Rome's backing. She and Caesar became lovers, and she bore him a son whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. When Caesar was assassinated in Rome in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's position became uncertain. She eventually aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of the men who divided Caesar's power. Their alliance was political as well as romantic. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to pursue his ambitions in the east. Cleopatra needed Antony's military power to secure Egypt's independence. Together, they represented one of the two great rival powers in the Roman world, the other being Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. The showdown came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra decisively. Antony, who had retreated to Alexandria, committed suicide. Cleopatra, who according to ancient sources tried and failed to negotiate terms with Octavian, also killed herself, reportedly by arranging to be bitten by a cobra, though the exact method is not certain. She was 39 years old. Caesarion was hunted down and killed shortly after. Octavian, who would take the name Augustus and become the first Roman emperor, made Egypt a province of Rome, not an ordinary province administered by senators, but a personal possession of the emperor, off limits to the senatorial class, whose presence in such a wealthy region might have made them dangerously powerful. Egypt was, from 30 BCE onward, Roman, and yet it did not stop being Egyptian. The Romans who governed Egypt were, like the Ptolemies before them, pragmatic enough to work within existing frameworks where it suited them. Roman emperors were depicted as pharaohs in the traditional manner on the walls of Egyptian temples. The Isis cult, one of the most popular forms of Egyptian religion, spread across the Roman Empire and attracted devotees as far north as Britain. Egyptian obelisks were transported to Rome and set up in public squares, where several still stand today. The cult of Serapis, a syncretic deity combining Egyptian and Greek elements, invented by the early Ptolemies, flourished throughout the Mediterranean world. But Roman Egypt was also a land of enormous social complexity and considerable tension. The native Egyptian population, the Greek-speaking urban elite, the Jewish community, and the Romans who administered the province existed in a hierarchy that was not always comfortable. Religious tensions occasionally erupted into violence. The Jewish community in Alexandria was attacked in a pogrom in 38 CE that the Jewish philosopher Philo, who witnessed it, described in horrifying detail. It was also in Egypt that a new religion, spreading from its origins in Judea, found some of its earliest and most enthusiastic converts. Christianity came to Egypt, according to tradition, through the evangelist Mark, who established the first church in Alexandria. By the 2nd century CE, there was a large and growing Christian community in Egypt. By the 3rd century, Egyptian Christianity had developed its own distinctive character, producing the Desert Fathers and Mothers, hermits and monks, who retreated into the desert to pursue spiritual perfection, and in doing so invented the institution of Christian monasticism that would shape the medieval world. As Christianity spread, the traditional Egyptian religion came under increasing pressure. The great temple complexes, which had been the centers of Egyptian life for 3 millennia, began to close. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the temple of Isis at Philae in 394 CE. The last known inscription in the Demotic script dates to 452 CE. After that, the ability to read the ancient writing was lost entirely and would not be recovered until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the work of Champollion in the early 19th century. Egypt passed from Roman to Byzantine rule as the empire reorganized itself around the new Christian faith. And then, in 641 CE, an Arab army under the general Amr ibn al-As captured Alexandria. Egypt became part of the expanding Islamic Caliphate and would remain under Arab and then later Ottoman rule for over 1,000 years, until the modern period. The story of ancient Egypt is, in the end, a story of extraordinary duration. 3,000 years from the first unified kingdom to the Arab conquest, 30 dynasties, dozens of pharaohs, periods of glory and periods of collapse, of conquest and reconquest, of artistic triumph and cultural revolution. What sustained Egypt across all those centuries was, at its deepest level, the river. The Nile's annual rhythm, its predictable flooding and receding, gave Egyptian civilization a stability that few other ancient societies possessed. It produced a surplus of grain that allowed large numbers of people to specialize in tasks other than farming. It created a natural highway for communication and trade. It oriented the Egyptian imagination towards cycles rather than linear time, toward the eternal return of the flood, toward the daily rebirth of the sun. The Egyptians understood something profound about the relationship between a civilization and its landscape. They knew that the desert on either side of the river was absolute. They knew that the black earth was a gift that could be withdrawn, and they built into their culture, from its earliest days, a reverence for the cycles that sustained them. Not because they were simple people who could not conceive of the world otherwise, but because they understood, in a way that perhaps only farmers really understand, that life is borrowed from the earth and must eventually be returned to it. Their obsession with death and the afterlife was not morbidity, it was an extension of the same intuition. Everything that dies is also, in some sense, being prepared for rebirth. The sun sets and rises again. The river dies back and floods again. The grain falls and returns. Even the king who died was not simply gone. He became Osiris, the god of the dead, the ruler of the underworld, and would rise again as his successor rose to take the throne. There is something in this that speaks across the millennia. We are not so different from the people who built the pyramids. We too look at the stars and wonder. We too bury our dead and leave them things they loved. We too build monuments and tell stories, and imagine that something of us might survive the decay of the body. The desert swallowed their cities. The sands drifted over the tombs. The scribes who could read the writing died, and then for 14 centuries no one on earth could decipher the carved words on the temple walls. But the stone remained, the gold remained, the mummies in their wrappings of linen remained, sleeping in their painted cases, surrounded by the objects they had carried with them into eternity. And when archaeologists began to dig, when Champollion broke the code of the hieroglyphics, when the tombs were opened and the mummies unwrapped, it was all still there, everything they had been, everything they had loved, everything they had believed, preserved in the dry air of the desert for thousands of years, waiting to be found. That is the miracle of Egypt, and perhaps the deepest lesson it offers, that what we build, if we build it with care and with love, can outlast us by millennia. That the things we make and the stories we tell can travel across time in ways we cannot predict or control. That even in the silence of the desert, even in the darkness of a sealed tomb, something persists. Something always persists. And so the river continues to flow, as it has flowed for millions of years, long before the first farmers settled on its banks, and long after the last of the old gods were forgotten. The Nile does not remember the pharaohs, or care about the names carved into its limestone cliffs. But it flows on, through the same landscape where Narmer first united two kingdoms, where Imhotep first stacked stone upon stone and reached for the sky, where Akhenaten looked at the disk of the sun and saw the face of God. The water that flows past Luxor today flowed past Thebes when Ramesses was building his temples. The light that falls on the desert at dawn is the same light that the priests at Heliopolis worshipped for 3,000 years. Nothing is entirely lost. Nothing is entirely gone. Let that be the last thought as sleep comes. Not of endings, not of the fall of kingdoms, or the silencing of scripts, or the sacking of temples, but of continuity, of the river that flows on, of the light that returns each morning, of the long, unbroken chain of human life on this extraordinary strip of earth beside the oldest river in the world. The story of Egypt is still being told. In the quiet of the desert night, in the shadow of the pyramids, in the smell of the Nile at dusk, it continues. Rest now. Let 3,000 years carry you gently into sleep. There is a detail about the ancient Egyptian year that tells you almost everything you need to know about how they understood the world. They divided their calendar into 3 seasons, not 4. Akhet, the season of inundation, when the Nile rose and the fields disappeared beneath the water. Peret, the season of growth, when the waters receded and the black earth appeared and the farmers planted their crops. And Shemu, the season of harvest, when the grain was cut and threshed and stored in the great granaries. 3 seasons, not 4, because winter, the season of cold and bare earth, the season of waiting, did not exist in Egypt the way it exists elsewhere. The cycle was simpler and more direct. Flood, grow, harvest, and then the flood again. Everything in Egyptian civilization was organized around this rhythm. The administrative year began with the flood. The great religious festivals were timed to the agricultural cycle. The very concept of the afterlife was shaped by it. Just as the fields died back each year and were reborn from the black earth, just as the sun set each evening in the west, traveled through the underworld, and rose again in the east, so the dead would pass through the darkness of death and emerge into a new existence. Not a ghostly half-life of shadows, but a real world, a better version of the world they had known, where the grain grew in abundance, and the beer was always good, and the fishing was always excellent, and the people you had loved were waiting for you. The Egyptians called this the Field of Reeds, the Aru. It was a place of ideal conditions, where everything was as it should have been in life, but freed from the difficulties and uncertainties of the mortal world. In the Field of Reeds, the wheat grew taller than it ever did in Egypt. The cattle were fat and plentiful. The Nile was always at the right height, its waters clear and full of fish. It was, in essence, Egypt perfected. But getting there required navigation. The passage through the underworld was not automatic or simple. The soul of the dead person had to undertake a journey through a series of gates and halls, each guarded by terrifying supernatural beings who had to be addressed by the correct names and pacified with the correct spells. The ancient Egyptians prepared for this journey with extraordinary care, producing collections of spells and instructions that Egyptologists call the Book of the Dead. Although the Egyptians themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is more accurate, it was not a book about death. It was a guidebook to survival. The richest Egyptians had elaborate personalized copies of the Book of the Dead made for them, painted on papyrus by skilled scribes and placed in their tombs. Poorer Egyptians might have only a few of the most essential spells, written on a strip of papyrus or inscribed on a ushabti figure, a small statuette that was supposed to do agricultural labor on behalf of the dead person in the Field of Reeds. Because even in the afterlife, someone had to work the fields. The ushabtis were the servants of eternity, and wealthy tombs might contain 400 of them, one for each day of the agricultural year, plus foremen to supervise them. The central drama of the journey through the underworld was the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, the dead person's heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The heart was believed to be the seat of the personality, the record of every thought and deed the person had ever had. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, the scale tipped, and the heart was devoured by the monster Amit, a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Devoured by Amit, the person faced a second death, a final death, the erasure of their existence from the cosmos. If the heart was in balance with the feather, the dead person was declared Keru, true of voice, justified, and they were led by the ibis-headed god, Thoth, into the presence of Osiris, to live forever in the Field of Reeds. The Egyptians prepared for this moment their entire lives, not with abstract philosophical contemplation, but with practical moral action. Texts like the Maxims of Ptahhotep, written during the Old Kingdom, offer advice on how to live rightly. Be humble before those above you. Be generous to those below you. Speak the truth. Do not oppress the poor. Be a good father and a good son. The values encoded in these maxims are not radically different from the values encoded in other ancient ethical systems. The Egyptians were not unusual in valuing honesty and generosity. What was unusual was the framework in which they placed those values. Your good deeds were not merely socially beneficial. They were being recorded in your heart and would be weighed at the moment of your death. Your whole life was a preparation for the scale. The relationship between the pharaoh and the gods was one of the organizing fictions of Egyptian civilization. And I use the word fiction not in the sense of falsehood, but in the sense of a shared imaginative framework. The pharaoh was, by definition, divine. He was the son of Ra, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god who ruled the living world, just as Osiris ruled the dead world. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris. When his successor was crowned, Horus was reborn in the living king. This framework served a political purpose that was entirely practical. By locating royal authority in the divine order of the cosmos, it made the pharaoh's rule not merely legitimate, but cosmically necessary. To oppose the pharaoh was not simply rebellion, it was the disruption of Ma'at, the cosmic order, a threat to the stability of the universe itself. This gave Egyptian kingship a kind of solidity and resilience that purely military or political authority cannot provide. The maintenance of Ma'at was the pharaoh's primary obligation, and the primary mechanism through which the pharaoh maintained Ma'at was ritual. Every day, in temples across Egypt, priests performed rituals on behalf of the pharaoh, who was theoretically present at all of them. The temple ritual involved waking the god, washing, dressing, and feeding the divine statue that was believed to house the god's spirit, presenting offerings of food and incense and music, and then closing the sanctuary. In theory, the pharaoh performed all of these rites personally. In practice, he delegated them to the priests, whose rituals maintained the fiction of royal presence. The temples themselves were conceived as cosmological models. The floor represented the primeval marsh. The columns were papyrus reeds. The ceiling was the sky. Moving from the entrance toward the inner sanctuary was moving from the ordinary world toward the sacred center of the universe. Only initiates could enter the outer courts. Only higher priests could enter the inner hall. Only the highest priests could enter the sanctuary where the god's statue dwelt, and even they covered their mouths with a cloth as they backed out of the presence of the divine, so that no human breath might contaminate the sacred space. This elaborate ritual life required a very large and very professional priestly class, which is one reason why the temples accumulated such enormous wealth. The great temple complex of Karnak at Thebes, which was expanded and embellished by almost every New Kingdom pharaoh for over 1,000 years, owned at its peak something like 500,000 head of cattle, 80,000 workers, and vast acreages of farmland. It was not merely a religious institution, it was one of the largest economic entities in the ancient world. The wealth of the temples was supposed to be at the service of the god, which in practice meant at the service of the pharaoh, who was the god's representative on earth. But when a pharaoh was weak, or when there was no strong central authority, the priests could become de facto rulers. This is what happened at the end of the New Kingdom, when the high priests of Amun at Thebes effectively governed Upper Egypt, while a line of kings ruled in the Delta. The power of the temple had grown so great that it could challenge the power of the throne. The ordinary Egyptian who lived in the shadow of these great institutions was a person whose world was defined above all by the river and the soil. Most Egyptians were farmers, and farming in the Nile Valley was a cycle of labor and waiting that left little room for the kind of individualism that characterizes modern life. You planted when the flood receded. You harvested when the crop was ready. You paid your taxes in grain, which was collected by officials and stored in royal granaries. You served in the army, if you were called. You contributed labor to building projects, the temples and tombs of the pharaohs, as a form of taxation. And in return, the state provided security, food in times of famine, and the ritual maintenance of the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising. The village was the basic unit of Egyptian social life. Most Egyptians were born in the same village their parents and grandparents had been born in and died there. They knew their neighbors' children, their neighbors' livestock, their neighbors' disputes. The village was a world almost complete in itself, connected to the wider world of temples and palaces and armies by the taxes that flowed upward, and the occasional contact with merchants or officials who passed through. The houses in which these ordinary Egyptians lived were built of mud brick, lagerkeim, a material superbly suited to the Egyptian climate. Mud brick was cheap, plentiful, easy to work, and excellent at regulating temperature, keeping the interior cool in the searing summer heat and warm on the occasional cool winter nights. A typical village house had 2 or 3 rooms, with a staircase leading to a flat roof where the family slept in the summer, catching the breeze off the river. There was a small courtyard, often shared with neighbors. The kitchen was usually a separate structure or an outdoor area to reduce the risk of fire. The diet of the ordinary Egyptian was simple but generally adequate. Bread was the staple, made from emmer wheat ground on flat stones. Beer was the universal drink, made from partially baked bread, dissolved in water and left to ferment. It was low in alcohol but high in calories, and a useful source of nutrition. Lentils, beans, and chickpeas provided protein. Fish from the Nile, dried and salted, were an important supplement. Vegetables, particularly onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce, were grown in the garden plots near the river. Meat was a luxury reserved for festivals and special occasions. Fruit, particularly figs, dates, and pomegranates, was widely available. Clothing was typically white linen, woven from flax that was grown extensively in the delta. Men wore kilts, women long sheaths. Children often wore nothing at all, which is depicted without any particular significance in Egyptian art. Jewelry was worn by both men and women at all levels of society. Even the poorest Egyptians wore amulets, small carved pendants in the shape of protective symbols: the Eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, the ankh, the was scepter. These were not merely decorative, they were practical, protective objects, believed to guard the wearer against disease, misfortune, and evil spirits. The Egyptians were not a gloomy people. Their art is full of scenes of feasting and dancing, of musicians playing harps and lutes and flutes, of people fishing and hunting birds in the papyrus marshes, of children playing games. They loved wordplay and wit. Their literature includes comic texts and satirical papyri showing animals in human roles, cats waiting on mice, mice attacking a fortified cat city. They wrote love poetry of considerable delicacy and feeling. A collection of love songs preserved from the New Kingdom includes verses comparing a beloved to a garden, to a fish trap that has caught the poet's heart, to a horse desired by many riders. They also drank heavily at festivals. There are Egyptian texts that record, with some relish, the consequences of excessive drinking at religious celebrations. The goddess Hathor, the patron of love and music and intoxication, presided over festivals where the whole point was to drink to excess and wake up on the festival ground the next morning in a state of holy communion with the goddess. Sacred inebriation was part of the religious toolkit, and the Egyptians were entirely comfortable with it. Let us stay for a moment with the question of the gods, because Egyptian theology is one of the most complex, layered, and frankly bewildering systems of religious thought ever developed. And it is also, once you begin to understand it, one of the most interesting. The first thing to understand is that Egyptian religion was never systematized in the way that later religions have been. There was no single sacred text that described the gods, their powers, and their relationships. There was no creed that every Egyptian was expected to accept. Different cities had different patron deities. Different periods emphasized different theological frameworks. And the Egyptians were entirely comfortable with apparent contradictions that would have driven a monotheistic theologian to despair. Consider the sun. The sun was, for the Egyptians, the most important cosmic force, the source of all life, the principle of creation and renewal. And yet the sun was not one god, but many. In the morning, the sun was Khepri, the scarab beetle, rolling the sun disk across the sky, just as a dung beetle rolls a ball of dung. At noon, the sun was Ra, the falcon-headed god, in his solar bark. In the evening, the sun was Atum, the old man. And at night, the sun travelled through the underworld as part of a complex journey that involved its own set of divine encounters and transformations. These were not different deities in competition with one another. They were different aspects of the same cosmic reality, different names for different moments in the eternal cycle. The Egyptians had a word for this kind of divine multiplicity, a concept that Egyptologists sometimes call syncretism. Two gods could be merged into one. Ra and Amun became Ra-Amun, or Amun-Ra, the king of the gods in the New Kingdom, combining the solar power of Ra with the hidden power of Amun, whose name means the hidden one. Ptah and Sokar and Osiris merged into Ptah Sokar Osiris, a composite funerary deity. The gods were not fixed, immutable beings. They were fluid, capable of fusion and transformation, just as everything in the Egyptian cosmos was ultimately a manifestation of the same underlying creative force. The most important myth in Egyptian religion was the story of Osiris, and it is worth telling in some detail because it underlies everything else. Osiris was the first king of Egypt, a god who had come to earth to teach humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, law, and the worship of the gods. He was beloved by his people and by his sister and wife Isis, the goddess of magic and the throne. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god of chaos, of the desert, of storms, of everything that lay outside the ordered world of the river valley. Set was jealous of Osiris's power, and in a moment of cosmic fratricidal rage, he murdered Osiris, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Isis, grief-stricken and desperate, traveled across the land to find the pieces of her husband's body. She found all of them, except one, which had been swallowed by a fish in the Nile. With her magical powers, she reassembled Osiris's body, wrapped it in linen, and breathed life back into it long enough to conceive a child, Horus. Then Osiris descended to the underworld, where he became its ruler, the king of the dead, the great judge who weighed the hearts of the deceased. Isis fled with the infant Horus to the papyrus marshes of the Delta, hiding from Set, and raised her son there in secret. When Horus was grown, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt. Their contest, which is described in a long mythological text called The Contendings of Horus and Set, involved a series of increasingly creative disputes adjudicated by the assembly of the gods. Horus ultimately prevailed. He became the king of the living world, the prototype of every pharaoh, and Set, though defeated, was not destroyed. He was given the desert and the storms and the chaos at the edges of the world to rule, because the Egyptians understood that chaos was not simply evil. It was a necessary part of existence. Without the desert, the black earth would have no meaning. Without Set, there would be no need for Horus. This myth was not just a story, it was the template for Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was Horus. When the pharaoh died, he became Osiris. When a new pharaoh was crowned, Horus was reborn. The eternal struggle between order and chaos was enacted every day in the rituals of the temple and the administration of the state. Every time the pharaoh defeated an enemy, he was Horus defeating Set. Every time the Nile flooded and brought the black earth, it was Osiris being reborn from the dead. And Isis, the devoted wife and resourceful mother, who searched the world for her husband's body and raised her son in hiding and used her magical skill to restore what had been destroyed, was in some ways the most human of the divine family. The Isis cult spread across the entire ancient world precisely because she embodied qualities that transcend any particular culture. Love that persists through death, grief that becomes the source of action, the determination to restore what has been broken. It is worth pausing to think about the extraordinary span of time we have been covering. When Tutankhamun died, around 1323 BCE, the pyramids at Giza were already more than 1,000 years old. They were ancient monuments to a past civilization. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom looked back at the pyramid builders the way we look back at the Romans. When we stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and feel its age, we are feeling something that the ancient Egyptians also felt. The pyramid was not merely old to them. It was almost incomprehensibly old, built by kings whose names were known only from the inscriptions on their monuments, whose world had receded into the same mythological distance that ancient Egypt now occupies for us. And yet the Egyptians never entirely lost their connection to that past. The Old Kingdom was their golden age, the time of the great pharaohs, the age of the pyramids, a period of almost legendary perfection against which all subsequent achievements were measured. The scribes copied Old Kingdom texts. The artists copied Old Kingdom artistic conventions. The later pharaohs restored and expanded Old Kingdom temples. The 25th dynasty, Nubian pharaohs, as I mentioned, deliberately revived Old Kingdom styles as a statement of legitimacy and cultural restoration. Even in the Ptolemaic period, some 3,000 years after the pyramids were built, a learned Egyptian priest could look at those structures and understand, at least in broad terms, who had built them and why. This continuity, this extraordinary persistence of cultural memory across 3 millennia, is one of the things that most distinguishes Egyptian civilization from almost every other. The ancient Greeks, who were passionate admirers of Egypt, could not have told you who built the Parthenon 600 years after its construction, because their society did not work that way. Their historical memory was shorter, more fragmented, less formally maintained. The Egyptians, with their practice of carving texts in stone and copying them in papyrus and training scribes across generations, maintained a cultural memory of exceptional depth and continuity. The military history of Egypt is not only the story of triumphs, it is also the story of a civilization that had to adapt, over centuries, to military technologies and political realities it had not anticipated. The Egyptian army of the Old Kingdom was primarily an infantry force, organized into units based on the nome, or administrative district, from which the soldiers were drawn. It was not a professional standing army in the modern sense, but a force assembled for specific campaigns and then demobilized. The weapons were copper axes and spears and bows, the same weapons used by Egypt's opponents. In this world, Egypt's advantages were logistical: the ability to organize and feed large numbers of men, and the wealth to equip them. The Hyksos invasion changed all of that. The horse-drawn chariot changed warfare in the ancient world in ways that nothing had changed it before. A well-trained chariot team, a driver and an archer, could deliver devastating archery against infantry that could not outmaneuver it. The composite bow, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, had far greater range and power than the simple wooden bows the Egyptians had previously used, and the Hyksos bronze weapons were harder and sharper than the copper equivalents. After the Hyksos were expelled, the Egyptians incorporated all of these technologies into their own military system and added some innovations of their own. The New Kingdom army was a professional force with a core of standing soldiers, augmented by conscripts for major campaigns and by mercenaries, particularly Nubian warriors called Medjay, who served as police and scouts. The chariotry formed an elite corps, the most prestigious arm of the military, whose officers were drawn from the nobility. The pharaoh himself was trained as a charioteer and was depicted in battle, standing in his chariot, bow drawn, the picture of martial supremacy. The logistics of Egyptian military campaigns were extraordinary. When Thutmose III marched into Asia for his campaigns, he brought with him not just soldiers, but a massive administrative tail: scribes to record the loot, priests to perform the necessary rituals, physicians, engineers to build siege works, supply officers managing the movement of food and water across desert routes. The campaign lists, inscribed on temple walls at Karnak, record the booty from Thutmose's campaigns with meticulous accounting. So many horses, so many chariots, so many weapons, so many talents of gold and silver, so many prisoners. War was not just a matter of military power for the Egyptians. It was a moral and cosmic event. When the pharaoh led his army into battle, he was not merely a general pursuing political objectives. He was the incarnation of Horus, the force of order, confronting the forces of chaos in the form of Egypt's enemies. The enemies of Egypt were, in Egyptian theology, the enemies of Ma'at. They were the chaos that threatened the divine order. To defeat them was to do the God's work, and to publicize the victory, to cover the temple walls with images of the triumphant pharaoh smiting his enemies, was to assert, permanently and visibly, that order had prevailed. This is why the images of pharaonic war are always so formulaic. The pharaoh stands in his chariot, enormous relative to the tiny enemies beneath his feet. He draws his bow. The enemies flee, or already lie defeated at the wheels of his chariot. It does not matter that the actual battle may have been close, or even partly unsuccessful, as Kadesh actually was. The image asserts the cosmic truth that transcends the military reality. Horus always defeats Set. Order always prevails over chaos. The pharaoh always wins. The complexity of Egyptian foreign policy in the New Kingdom is often underestimated. Egypt was not simply a military power that sent armies to conquer. It was a sophisticated diplomatic player that maintained relationships with the major powers of the ancient Near East through a system of royal correspondence, gift exchange, and strategic marriage. The Amarna letters, the cache of clay tablets found in 1887 at the site of ancient Akhetaten, include correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, Mitanni, Cyprus, and the various kings of Canaan. The letters are written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, the equivalent of Latin in medieval Europe, or English in the modern world. They reveal a world of considerable sophistication and, at times, considerable tension. The rulers of the great powers wrote to the Egyptian king as brothers, acknowledging each other's status as equals. In a world where most relationships were hierarchical, they exchanged gifts: Egyptian gold for Babylonian lapis lazuli, fine linen for horses, diplomatic brides whose daughters were sent across hundreds of miles to be married into the Egyptian royal family. The correspondence is full of protocol and etiquette, and underneath it all, hard-headed calculation. The kings of Canaan, who were Egyptian vassals, wrote in a very different register, abasing themselves before the pharaoh, addressing him as the son, my God, my Lord, swearing eternal loyalty, and pleading for Egyptian troops to help them against their enemies. The difference in tone between these letters and those from the great kings reflects the difference in power. The vassal had to flatter, the equal merely had to negotiate. What makes the Amarna letters particularly poignant is the period during which many of them were written. During the reign of Akhenaten, the great diplomatic machine of the Egyptian state appears to have slowed or stalled. Appeals from vassal rulers in Canaan for troops, for gold, for reassurance, go unanswered or receive only vague responses. The city of Sumer falls to Egypt's enemies. Rib-Hadda of Byblos writes letter after letter, more than 70 surviving, each more desperate than the last, describing his city's peril and pleading for help that apparently never came. Whether Akhenaten was genuinely negligent, or whether the surviving letters give an incomplete picture of a more active foreign policy, is debated. But the image that emerges from the tablets is of an empire beginning to lose its grip at the edges, while its king focused on theological revolution at home. By the time the New Kingdom ended around 1070 BCE, Egypt had lost its empire in Asia, its control of Nubia, and much of its internal coherence. What followed was 4 centuries of decline, fragmentation, foreign domination, and occasional revival that is collectively known as the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period. These are the centuries that history tends to pass over quickly in the story of Egypt, the long afternoon after the brilliant morning of the New Kingdom. But they are not without their own extraordinary moments and figures. The 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty that ruled Egypt from around 747 to 664 BCE, is one of the great paradoxes of Egyptian history. These were kings from the land to the south, from Kush, from Napata, from a civilization that Egypt itself had conquered and colonized centuries before. The Nubians had been Egyptianized over generations of contact, adopting the Egyptian language, Egyptian religion, and Egyptian royal customs. When they swept into Egypt and reunified the country, they did so in the name of Egyptian tradition. Their inscriptions are in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Their statues are in the Egyptian style, but with distinctly African features. Their building programs revived Old Kingdom forms that had been dormant for centuries. The most famous of the Nubian pharaohs, Taharqa, ruled from around 690 to 664 BCE, and was one of the most capable rulers Egypt had seen in generations. He is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as an enemy of Assyria, and indeed his reign coincided with Assyria's expansion into the Levant. Taharqa attempted to resist the Assyrian advance, fighting several campaigns in support of the besieged cities of the Levant. He was ultimately unsuccessful. The Assyrian armies were too powerful and too well organized. They pushed into Egypt, sacked Memphis, and eventually sacked Thebes. The physical evidence of Taharqa's reign is scattered across the ancient Sudanese and Egyptian landscape. He built at Karnak, at Kawa, at Sanam, at Nuri, where his pyramid still stands. Nubian pyramids are different from the Egyptian ones, steeper and narrower, but they reflect the same impulse, the same belief in royal divinity and the permanence of the afterlife. And they were built not in Egypt, but in Nubia, where the Nubian kings ultimately retreated after the Assyrian onslaught. The Nubian kingdom of Kush survived and flourished long after it lost control of Egypt, for another 1,000 years in fact, evolving and adapting, while Egypt itself went through Roman and Byzantine and Arab rule. The city of Meroe, which became the Kushite capital, was a sophisticated iron smelting center whose products were traded across Africa. When British forces under Kitchener pushed up the Nile in the late 19th century, they found hundreds of Nubian pyramids still standing in the desert near Meroe, monuments to a civilization that had kept the Egyptian tradition alive long after Egypt itself had ceased to be Egyptian in any traditional sense. The Sate period, which I mentioned earlier, deserves a somewhat longer consideration because it represents Egypt's last truly independent flowering, and because the Sate pharaohs are among the most interesting and least well-known rulers in Egyptian history. The dynasty took its name from the city of Sais in the western delta, which had been an important regional center for generations. Psamtik I, the founder, came to power with Assyrian backing, but quickly established genuine independence as Assyrian power began to contract. His successors pursued a foreign policy of considerable sophistication, playing the emerging powers of the ancient world against one another. Necho II, who ruled from about 610 to 595 BCE, was one of the most forward-looking pharaohs of the late period. He attempted to dig a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, a project that foreshadowed the Suez Canal by 2.5 millennia. He commissioned a Phoenician fleet to circumnavigate Africa, a voyage that, according to Herodotus, the Phoenician sailors accomplished successfully over the course of 3 years. He also fought the Babylonians at the famous Battle of Megiddo, where he defeated and killed Josiah, the king of Judah, an event that is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. His reign shows an Egypt that was still capable of bold action on the world stage. Apries, another Sate king, sent Egyptian forces to support Phoenician Tyre against Babylonian siege and deployed a fleet in the Mediterranean. His military ambitions ultimately exceeded his reach, and his defeat in a disastrous Libyan campaign led to his overthrow by the general Ahmose II, who would rule for 44 years and is remembered as one of the most effective administrators of the late period. Ahmose II had an interesting relationship with the Greek world. He was famous for his friendship with the Greek mercenaries, who formed a significant part of his army, for his patronage of Greek sanctuaries, and for his marriage to a Greek woman from Cyrene. He gave the Greek traders the city of Naucratis in the Delta as a permanent trading base, and he sent lavish gifts to Greek sanctuaries, including a contribution to the rebuilding of the temple at Delphi after it burned down. He was, in short, the prototype of the kind of cosmopolitan Egyptian ruler that the Ptolemies would later aspire to be. His reign ended in 526 BCE, and he died just before the Persian invasion. Some ancient sources claim he died knowing what was coming, spared the humiliation of defeat by a timely death. Whether that is true or simply a story shaped by what came after, it has a certain elegiac quality. The last effective native pharaoh of ancient Egypt, dying as the world he had known was about to change forever. The Persian occupation of Egypt, which began with Cambyses II's conquest in 525 BCE, and lasted, with interruptions, until Alexander's arrival in 332 BCE, was a complex and often tense episode in Egyptian history. Cambyses is remembered by the ancient sources, both Greek and Egyptian, as a tyrant and a madman. He supposedly stabbed the sacred Apis bull, laughed at the Egyptian religious customs, and desecrated temples. Modern scholarship has been somewhat skeptical of these stories, which were mostly written by people who had reason to portray the Persian conquest as sacrilege. The administrative records of the Persian period show Cambyses making dedications to Egyptian temples and adopting pharaonic titles in at least some contexts, which is not the behavior of a man who despised Egyptian religion. But there is no doubt that the Persian occupation was experienced by many Egyptians as humiliation. Egypt had, for 3,000 years, been either an independent civilization or, in the periods of foreign domination, eventually able to reassert itself. The Persian Empire was different in scale. It stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean, encompassing territories far beyond what any Egyptian army had ever reached. There was no obvious route to independence, and the Persians were not going to Egyptianize the way the Hyksos or the Nubians had. There were revolts. The Egyptians rose against Persian rule multiple times over the 2 centuries of Persian occupation, and at least twice succeeded in expelling the Persians for significant periods. The period from about 404 to 343 BCE is known as the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, a period of native Egyptian rule in which a succession of kings from different cities in the Delta attempted to maintain independence. The last of these, Nectanebo II, was a capable ruler who built extensively, restored temples, and maintained Egyptian sovereignty for more than a decade before the Persians returned in force in 343 BCE. Nectanebo II fled south as the Persian army advanced. He may have retreated to Nubia, the last refuge of Egyptian independence. He disappears from history, the last native pharaoh of Egypt. In later legend, he became a wizard who used magic to defend Egypt, and stories of his magical exploits were told long after his actual reign had been forgotten. The landscape that Alexander entered in 332 BCE was not the monolithic civilization it might appear from a distance. It was a country of enormous complexity, where ancient traditions persisted in the temples and priestly communities, while the administration was conducted in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, and where the Delta population included large communities of Greek merchants, Phoenician traders, Jewish settlers, and Libyan soldiers. It was a country exhausted by a century of foreign occupation, but still possessed of an extraordinary cultural vitality. Alexander's visit to the Oracle of Siwa is one of the most mysterious episodes in his career. He traveled through the western desert for several weeks to reach the oasis where the Oracle of Amun-Zeus, as the Greeks identified the Egyptian god, was housed. He was received there and reportedly received an answer to the question he asked. What the question was and what the answer was, Alexander never said. He told only one person, his mother Olympias, and in a letter, various ancient sources offer guesses. Was it confirmation that he was the son of a god? Was it a prophecy about his future conquests? Was it something more personal? We simply do not know. What we do know is that Alexander left Siwa with his sense of divine mission, already strong, apparently reinforced. He founded Alexandria, set the administrative structure of Egypt in motion, and then left, never to return. The city that bore his name would become, in the centuries following his death, one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen. At its peak under the early Ptolemies, Alexandria had a population of perhaps 500,000 people, making it the second largest city in the ancient world after Rome. It was the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, the commercial hub of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the site of the famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which guided ships into the harbour from miles out at sea. The Library of Alexandria was not a single building but a complex of research institutions, lecture halls, and collections that attracted scholars from across the Greek-speaking world. The goal, reportedly stated by Ptolemy I, was to collect all the books in the world. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were searched, and any books on board were confiscated and copied. The copies returned to the ship's owner, while the originals were added to the collection. At its height, the library reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is that it was not destroyed in a single dramatic event. Despite the popular narrative, the fire attributed to Julius Caesar in 48 BCE destroyed a warehouse full of books destined for shipment, not the library itself. The library declined gradually over several centuries, its funding reduced, its collections dispersed, its scholars moving elsewhere as Alexandria's political importance diminished. By the time the Arab conquest came in 641 CE, what remained of the ancient library was a shadow of its former self. The Ptolemaic dynasty lasted for nearly 3 centuries, from Ptolemy I's declaration of kingship in 305 BCE to Cleopatra VII's death in 30 BCE. It was not a static period. The dynasty changed considerably across those 300 years, as each generation faced new challenges and adapted to new circumstances. The early Ptolemies, particularly the first 3, were active, energetic rulers who built institutions and pursued ambitions across the eastern Mediterranean. Ptolemy I secured Egypt and built the foundational institutions. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was the builder of the Pharaohs lighthouse and the great patron of the library, also presided over a golden age of Alexandrian literature. The poets Callimachus, Theocritus, and Apollonius of Rhodes all worked under his patronage. He extended Egyptian commercial reach into Africa and Arabia, establishing a series of elephant hunting stations on the Red Sea coast to capture the African elephants that were used as war animals. He also published a decree in both Greek and Egyptian on a stele discovered at Rosetta in 1799, a decree that would, 18 centuries later, provide the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. Ptolemy III Euergetes carried Egyptian armies further into Asia than any ruler since Thutmose III, at one point reaching deep into Mesopotamia before being recalled by news of unrest at home. His return was celebrated with a great procession in Alexandria that ancient sources describe in staggering detail, with elaborate floats depicting the gods, hundreds of animals, thousands of soldiers, and rivers of wine flowing through the streets. After Euergetes, the dynasty became increasingly introspective. The later Ptolemies more focused on the complex internal politics of the Alexandrian court than on external ambition. The Ptolemaic court was a world of extraordinary sophistication and considerable danger. Brothers killed sisters, mothers killed sons, children were pawns in the political games of regents and advisors. The history of the later Ptolemaic dynasty reads at times like a particularly dark work of fiction, and through all of this, Rome grew stronger. The Roman Republic, which had first sent ambassadors to Ptolemaic Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, had by the 1st century BCE become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Egypt's independence survived only because Rome chose to allow it, because Egypt's grain was too useful to Rome, and because the Ptolemaic dynasty was skilled at playing the complex game of Roman politics. Cleopatra VII was the last and most brilliant player of that game. She aligned herself first with Caesar and then with Antony, always with the same goal: to preserve Egypt's independence and to secure the succession of her children. She failed in the end, but she failed against Octavian, who was by far the most politically capable man of his generation, the man who would remake the Roman world as the first emperor Augustus. Against someone of that caliber, even Cleopatra's extraordinary intelligence and political skill were not enough. Her death on the 13th of August, 30 BCE, marked the end of 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian civilization. From Narmer's unification of the two lands around 3100 BCE to the last Ptolemaic ruler's death in 30 BCE is approximately 3,070 years. Every generation of rulers, Egyptian and foreign, had maintained the fundamental framework of the pharaonic state: the temple rituals, the agricultural administration, the ideology of divine kingship. Even the Romans, in their first centuries of rule, maintained much of this framework, depicting their emperors as pharaohs on temple walls, continuing the temple rituals in Egyptian rather than Roman forms. But the center of gravity had shifted permanently. Egypt was now a province. Its capital was no longer a power in the ancient world. Its kings had become governors and prefects appointed in Rome. The gods of the Nile Valley would for a time continue to be worshipped, would continue to attract pilgrims and devotees from across the Mediterranean world. But they were no longer the official gods of a sovereign state. They were the exotic, fascinating, somewhat mysterious heritage of a conquered people. The late antique period in Egypt, from roughly the 1st to the 7th centuries CE, is a period of remarkable religious complexity and sometimes violent transition. The Roman province of Egypt was home to a population that included traditional Egyptian polytheists, the large Jewish community of Alexandria, an enormous Greek-speaking pagan population, and the growing Christian community. The Christians of Egypt, as I mentioned earlier, had their own distinctive character. Egyptian Christianity developed the first monastic movement, with the Desert Fathers retreating to the eastern and western deserts of Egypt to pursue spiritual perfection through asceticism and prayer. The most famous of these was Anthony of the Desert, a wealthy young Coptic Egyptian who sold all his possessions, gave the money to the poor, and went to live alone in the desert, sometime around 270 CE. He lived for over 100 years, according to the traditional account, and became the model for the entire monastic tradition. The spiritual writings of the Egyptian Desert Fathers, collected in a text called The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, the Apophthegmata Patrum, are extraordinary documents of human religious experience. They are not systematic theology. They are stories and sayings and encounters, practical wisdom about how to live, how to deal with anger and pride and lust and despair, how to be kind to others without losing oneself. They are, in many ways, continuous with the practical wisdom tradition of ancient Egyptian texts, like the maxims of Ptahhotep. The landscape and the religion had changed, but the desire to understand how to live well in a difficult world was the same. The Coptic Christian tradition that developed in Egypt created a distinctive liturgical language, Coptic, which was essentially the ancient Egyptian language written in a modified Greek alphabet. Coptic texts preserved the sounds of the ancient Egyptian language, which had been unspoken for centuries, and this turned out to be crucially important when scholars began to decipher hieroglyphics in the 19th century. Knowing how the Coptic words sounded gave them a key to the phonetic system that Champollion needed to crack the code. The conversion of Egypt to Christianity was gradual and sometimes violent. Pagan temples were closed, converted to churches, or destroyed. The Great Serapeum of Alexandria, the most magnificent temple in the ancient world, according to ancient accounts, was destroyed by a Christian mob in 391 CE under the instigation of the bishop Theophilus. The philosopher Hypatia, a woman who taught mathematics and Neoplatonic philosophy in Alexandria, was murdered by another Christian mob in 415 CE, in a killing that has since become a symbol of religious fanaticism's assault on learning. By the 5th century, traditional Egyptian religion was effectively extinct as a living practice, surviving only in the temple complex at Philae, on an island in the Nile near the First Cataract, which remained a center of Isis worship until it was finally closed by the Emperor Justinian around 535 CE. The last hieroglyphic inscription, as I noted, dates to 394 CE, carved at Philae by a priest who may well have been one of the last people alive who knew how to write that script. What came after was, in some ways, a continuation. The Coptic Christian tradition preserved remarkable elements of ancient Egyptian religion in transformed and Christianized form. The Christian concept of the afterlife in Egypt was deeply influenced by Egyptian ideas. The desert monasteries, built at the sites of ancient temples in some cases, continued practices of contemplation and communal life that had precursors in the communities of temple priests. And then came the Arab conquest. In 641 CE, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As completed the conquest of Egypt for the expanding Islamic Caliphate. The Byzantine garrison of Alexandria surrendered after a short siege, and Egypt entered a new era that would last for over 1,000 years and fundamentally transform the population's language, religion, and cultural identity. The Arabic language gradually displaced Coptic as the everyday language, though Coptic survived in liturgical use in the Coptic Christian community, where it remains in use today. Islam became the majority religion, though a significant Christian minority persisted and continues to exist. The physical monuments of the ancient world survived the Arab conquest better than one might expect. The pyramids were a source of wonder and occasional despoliation, but they were too large and too solid to be simply demolished. The temples, some of which had already been converted to churches, were converted to mosques or simply abandoned. The desert, which had preserved so much for so long, continued its patient work of conservation, covering over what human hands could not reach. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt by the modern world began, in earnest, with Napoleon's Egyptian campaign of 1798. Napoleon brought with him not just soldiers, but a team of scientists, artists, and scholars, whose mission was to study and document everything they found. The multi-volume Description de l'Egypte that resulted from this expedition was one of the foundational documents of Egyptology, introducing the wonders of the Nile Valley to a European audience hungry for the exotic and the ancient. It was during Napoleon's campaign that a French soldier, digging fortifications near a town called Rosetta in the Delta, turned up a stone bearing the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. The Rosetta Stone. Because the Greek was readable, and because it described the contents of the decree it recorded, it gave scholars their first systematic tool for understanding the relationship between the 3 scripts. The man who finally cracked the hieroglyphic code was Jean-François Champollion, a Frenchman who had been obsessed with Egypt since childhood. Working from the Rosetta Stone and from other inscriptions, particularly those on obelisks where royal names could be isolated, Champollion realized in September 1822 that hieroglyphics were not merely symbolic pictures, but included phonetic signs representing sounds of the ancient Egyptian language. In a famous episode, he reportedly ran to his brother's office, crying, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," and collapsed from excitement. With the decipherment of hieroglyphics, 3,000 years of Egyptian history became, for the first time, directly readable, not through the accounts of Greek and Roman observers, not through the limited information that could be deduced from images and objects, but through the words of the Egyptians themselves. Their prayers, their histories, their love songs, their medical texts, their administrative records, their religious beliefs, all of it suddenly accessible. What the texts revealed was more complex, more human, and more interesting than the cold stone monuments had suggested. Here were people worrying about their health, writing letters to their mothers, complaining about dishonest business partners, falling in love, mourning the dead, hoping for the future. The Egyptians became, through their own words, not mysterious ancients but recognizable humans. The site of Deir el-Medina, a village near Thebes on the west bank of the Nile, gives us perhaps the most intimate portrait of life in ancient Egypt that has survived from any period. This was the village where the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens lived with their families. It was occupied from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE. The entire span of the New Kingdom and the dry desert air preserved an extraordinary quantity of texts and objects. The workers of Deir el-Medina were skilled craftsmen, painters and sculptors and carpenters who formed a community apart from the rest of Egyptian society. They knew the locations of the royal tombs, which made them both valuable and dangerous, and they were therefore housed in a separate village and kept somewhat isolated from the outside world. They were supplied by the state with grain, fish, vegetables, pottery, and other essentials. The texts from Deir el-Medina include official records, religious texts, and a remarkable quantity of what scholars call ostraca, potsherds, or limestone flakes used as notepads, which preserve the informal, everyday writing of people who were literate enough to write, but not wealthy enough to use papyrus for casual purposes. On these ostraca, we find shopping lists and love letters and complaints to supervisors and notes about the weather and reports of dreams and records of workers' absences and the reasons given for them. One worker was absent because he had been drinking with his colleagues. Another was absent because his wife was ill. A third was absent because he was embalming a relative. A foreman records that a worker was seen by his neighbours dragging bricks, which might mean he was carrying on some private construction work while supposed to be on the job. The grain deliveries were late 1 month, and a delegation of workers left the village and sat down on the threshold of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III in protest, refusing to leave until their supplies arrived. The first recorded labour strike in history, as I mentioned, preserved in the administrative records of men who were simply trying to make sure their families had enough to eat. The workers of Deir el-Medina also built their own tombs, smaller and less elaborate than the royal tombs they created for their employers, but richly decorated. The paintings in these tombs show the same scenes of the afterlife that appear in royal tombs, scaled to a more modest budget. The field of reeds, the weighing of the heart, the journey through the underworld. The workers believed they were going to the same place as the pharaoh. The religious framework was democratic in this sense, available to anyone who could afford the spells and the preparation. There is a text from ancient Egypt that I find myself returning to again and again, a text that seems to speak across the millennia with unusual directness and clarity. It is a poem known as the Harper's Song, found in various versions in several tombs, and it deals with unusual candor for Egyptian literature, with the uncertainty of the afterlife. The poem begins with a meditation on the tombs of the great kings. Where are those who built them? It asks. Their walls have fallen, their places are forgotten, their names are no longer spoken. The poem asks, in essence, what good did all that careful preparation do? The tombs crumble, the names are forgotten. What remains? And then it answers, in a way that is characteristic of a certain strain of Egyptian thought. What remains is the pleasure of being alive. Celebrate while you live, the poem says. Dress yourself in fine linen. Anoint yourself with oil. Play music. Be with the ones you love. Because no one has ever returned from the land of the dead to tell us what it is like. So live fully now, while you are here. This poem exists in a civilization that spent enormous energy and resources on preparing for the afterlife, and yet here is a voice that doubts, or at least acknowledges the doubt. That suggests the living moment is precious, precisely because we do not know what comes after. The Egyptians were not monolithic in their beliefs. They were human beings, with all the complexity and self-contradiction that implies. The Harper's Song is not a rejection of Egyptian religion, it is a meditation within it. A song that acknowledges the mystery at the heart of everything the Egyptians built and believed and hoped. And it is, in the end, an invitation to be present. To enjoy the body while it breathes. To love the people who are here. To be grateful for the light and the river and the bread and the beer and the music. Good advice from people who have been gone for 3,000 years. The stone is still there. The words can still be read. The advice still holds. The legacy of ancient Egypt in the world that followed it is incalculably large. The monotheism of Akhenaten, whether directly or indirectly, may have influenced the development of the biblical tradition, a question that scholars debate with intensity and that may never be definitively resolved. The Isis cult spread throughout the Roman Empire and shaped early Christian iconography, with the image of Isis nursing the infant Horus, providing a template for later images of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child. Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were transmitted through Greek scholars who visited or worked in Alexandria, contributing to the foundations of the Western scientific tradition. The concept of the week, of the 24-hour day, of the 365-day year all have Egyptian roots. Egyptian obelisks, transported to Rome and later to other European capitals, served as markers of power and continuity for 2,000 years. The obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo in Rome was brought there by Augustus to celebrate his conquest of Egypt. The one in the Place de la Concorde in Paris was given to France by Muhammad Ali in 1833. The ones in London and New York, both known as Cleopatra's Needles despite having nothing to do with Cleopatra, were moved from Alexandria in the 19th century. They are messengers from another world, standing in modern cities, covered with the words of a language that was once forgotten and is now readable again. The pyramids have been a source of wonder and speculation for every generation that has seen them. The ancient Greeks listed the Great Pyramid among the 7 wonders of the world. Medieval Arab travelers wrote about them with awe. Napoleon, arriving in Egypt in 1798, reportedly told his soldiers that from the top of those pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon them. The pyramids have been the subject of more nonsensical speculation than almost any other ancient monument. Theories involving lost continents and alien constructors and secret chambers hiding the secrets of the universe. They have attracted charlatans and visionaries and tourists and scholars in equal measure. What the pyramids actually are, when you let them speak for themselves without the overlay of mysticism, is even more remarkable than any of the theories. They are the product of an organized, literate, technically sophisticated civilization that chose to express its beliefs and its power through an act of collective creation on an almost incomprehensible scale. They are declarations of faith in the immortality of the human soul, built by people who believed, with a certainty we can barely imagine, that the dead lived on, that the king who lay inside would rise again, that the sun that set in the west would rise again in the east, that the river that dried back would flood again, that nothing was ever truly lost. Sleep comes easier, sometimes, when you are held by something vast, not by noise or distraction or the scrolling urgency of the present moment, but by the great, slow current of history, by the knowledge that human beings have been here before, have lived and loved and built and lost and started again, for thousands and thousands of years. The last pharaoh of a truly independent Egypt died in the 4th century BCE. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in the 4th century CE. The last daily worship at an Egyptian temple ended in the 6th century CE. And yet, the Nile still flows. The pyramids still stand. The desert still holds, in its dry and patient embrace, thousands of tombs and temples and villages and documents that have not yet been found, are being found now, will be found by people not yet born. There is something extraordinarily comforting about this, if you let yourself feel it. The things that matter endure, not necessarily in the form in which they were created. The Great Pyramid is not now what it was when it was first cased in white limestone and capped with a pyramidion of electrum shining across the desert in the morning sun. But it endures. The stories told in the tombs, the prayers carved on the temple walls, the letters written on papyrus and preserved in the dry air, they endure imperfectly, incompletely, but they endure. The Egyptians believed in eternity. They believed that what they made with care and love and faith would last. They were not entirely wrong. Here we are, thousands of years later, speaking their names, reading their words, walking in their streets, such as they are, preserved under the sand and the rock, visiting their tombs and standing in the same space where they once laid their dead, surrounded by everything they hoped the dead would need. Narmer, Djoser, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Cleopatra. The names travel across 3,000 years and land here, in the quiet of this hour, in the dark behind your eyes. Let them carry you now, into the deep, peaceful current of sleep, into the same darkness that the sun travels each night, before it rises again in the east. The river flows on, the light returns. Rest well. There is one more corner of ancient Egypt's world that deserves our attention before we close tonight's journey. And that is the world of Egyptian science and medicine, because it tells us something important about how these people understood the universe. Egyptian medicine was, by the standards of its time, remarkably sophisticated. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, named for the American dealer who purchased it in 1862, is perhaps the most extraordinary medical document to survive from the ancient world. Probably written in the early Second Intermediate period, but clearly drawing on much older sources, possibly from the Old Kingdom itself, it describes 48 cases of injury, arranged systematically from head to feet. Each case is described in the same format: examination, diagnosis, and treatment, and the approach is unmistakably empirical. The physician who compiled these cases was not relying on magic or prayers. He was recording what he had observed. He describes the structure of the skull, noting the sutures between the plates of bone. He identifies conditions such as broken ribs, spinal injuries, and dislocated jaws. He distinguishes between injuries that can be treated, injuries that might be treatable but are uncertain, and injuries where no treatment is possible. In the case of a patient with an open fracture of the skull, the papyrus notes that the physician will observe swelling and fever and pulsation beneath the fracture, the pulsation of the brain. This is, as far as we know, the first recorded description of the pulse of the brain in human history. The Ebers Papyrus, another medical document from roughly the same period, takes a somewhat different approach, mixing empirical observation with magical formulas. But it too contains remarkable material, including a description of depression and its treatment, a discussion of the heart and its function in the circulatory system, and descriptions of surgical techniques for various conditions. The ancient Egyptians knew that the heart was the center of the body's life. They believed it was the seat of the personality and the intellect, which is why it was left in the body during mummification, while the brain was removed through the nose with a hooked instrument, considered of little importance. The tension between empirical observation and magical belief in Egyptian medicine is not, actually, a contradiction if you understand the Egyptian worldview. In a world where the gods governed everything, illness was not simply a mechanical malfunction. It was a disruption of the cosmic order, a manifestation of malevolent forces that needed to be addressed on both the physical and the spiritual level. A physician who gave a patient a medicinal herb and also recited a spell over it was not being inconsistent. He was treating the whole problem, physical and spiritual, simultaneously. The Egyptians had a detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines. The Ebers Papyrus lists hundreds of substances and their applications. Some of these have been validated by modern pharmacology. Willow bark, for instance, which they used for pain relief, contains salicin, the chemical precursor of aspirin. Honey, which they used extensively for wound dressings, has genuine antibacterial properties. Garlic, which appears in many of their prescriptions, has medically active compounds. They also performed surgery. Evidence from mummies includes healed fractures that were set correctly, indicating that the physicians who treated them understood how to align broken bones. There are examples of amputations that the patient survived, and at least one case of what appears to be successful brain surgery, a hole drilled in the skull, a procedure known as trepanation, with healed bone growth around the edges, indicating that the patient lived for some time afterward. The physician who performed these procedures was, in Egyptian society, a person of high status. The greatest of them, like Imhotep, could be deified after death. There were specialists, physicians who focused on specific areas of the body. One ancient title translates as Shepherd of the Anus, which the Egyptians apparently considered a specialty worthy of formal designation. The medical profession was hereditary in some cases, with medical knowledge passed down within families or taught in the temple schools, where the priestly and scribal classes received their education. Egyptian mathematics was equally impressive for its time. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, purchased by a Scottish lawyer named Alexander Henry Rhind in Luxor in 1858, and now in the British Museum, contains a collection of mathematical problems and their solutions that reveals the sophistication of Egyptian arithmetic. They used a decimal system with no place value, representing numbers through repetition of symbols for 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1 million. They could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. They understood fractions, though their approach to them was different from ours. They could calculate the area of a circle, the volume of a cylinder, and the slope of a pyramid. That last calculation was not academic. The construction of the pyramids required an understanding of geometry that is, even by modern standards, impressive. The angle of slope of a pyramid had to be precisely maintained across 4 sides, each hundreds of meters long. The base had to be almost perfectly square. The alignment to the cardinal directions, particularly in the case of Khufu's pyramid, which is aligned to true north within about 3 minutes of arc, had to be achieved without magnetic compasses, which the Egyptians did not have. How they achieved these things is partly understood and partly mysterious. They appear to have used tools for measuring right angles, for establishing horizontal levels, and for orienting structures astronomically. They understood how to use the stars to determine north. They calculated slopes using a unit called the sekhed, which is essentially a measure of horizontal run per unit of vertical rise. But the details of their surveying methods, particularly for the largest structures, remain a matter of active scholarly investigation. the Egyptians were also accomplished astronomers. They divided the night sky into 36 decans, groups of stars whose heliacal rising. The first appearance in the eastern sky, just before dawn, after a period of invisibility. They used to divide the night into hours and to track the seasons. They identified and named the planets, calling them wandering stars. They tracked the movements of the moon and developed a lunar calendar alongside their solar one. They knew the Milky Way and had a name for it. Their astronomical knowledge was put to practical use in the alignment of monuments. The Great Pyramid's air shafts, which were long believed to be ventilation shafts, but are now understood to have been ritual channels for the soul of the dead king, are aligned with certain stars. The southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed, at the time of the pyramid's construction, toward Orion's belt, which the Egyptians associated with Osiris. The northern shaft pointed toward Thuban, the pole star of that era. In the queen's chamber, the southern shaft pointed toward Sirius, the star associated with Isis, whose heliacal rising marked the beginning of the Nile flood each year. These alignments were not accidents. They were the expression of a cosmology, a deliberate embedding of the pyramid into the fabric of the universe as the Egyptians understood it. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a mechanism for the royal soul's journey to the stars. The ancient Egyptians left us, finally, a gift that is both simpler and more profound than all the pyramids and temples and texts. The proof that it is possible to build something that lasts. That human beings, working together, organized by shared belief and governed by shared values, can create things that persist for millennia. That beauty made with care can survive longer than stone. That the words of people who lived 3,000 years ago can still be heard, still move us, still make us think and feel. The world is full of the ruins of civilizations. The Egyptians are unique not because they were perfect, they were not, or because their civilization never failed, it did, but because they understood from the beginning that what they were trying to do was something permanent. They built for eternity. They carved their words in stone because stone lasts. They mummified their dead because they believed the body would be needed again. They painted their tombs with vivid scenes of earthly pleasure because they believed those pleasures would continue. They were not wrong to try. The pyramids are still there. The temples are still there. The mummies are still there, sleeping in their cases. Some of them on display in museums where millions of people pass them every year and feel that strange double sensation of wonder and discomfort, of recognition and distance. These were people. These were the people who built the pyramids, who wrote the love songs, who worried about their grain rations, who prayed to their gods in the quiet darkness of the inner sanctuary. They were here. They lived, and something of them is still here. That is, in the end, what any civilization is trying to achieve. Not just survival in the biological sense, not just the continuation of the genes, but the continuation of the spirit. The transmission of values and stories and beliefs and art from one generation to the next, across the impossible distance of time. The Egyptians managed this transmission in ways they could never have anticipated, across 3,000 years of their own civilization, and then across another 2,000 years of forgetting and rediscovery, to reach us here, now, in this moment, in the quiet of whatever night this is for you, wherever in the world you are lying down, the light going off or already dark, the body settling into the slow rhythm of approaching sleep. Let this be the last thought, that you are part of this same long chain, that the things you love and the stories you tell and the care you bring to your own small corner of the world are also going somewhere, traveling forward into a future you will never see, toward people who are not yet born, who will find in what you have left behind some thread of connection, some point of recognition, some moment of thinking, ah, yes, someone who felt this too. The Egyptians called their dead the justified, Ma Keru, true of voice, those whose hearts were in balance, who had lived rightly and loved well. May you rest tonight in that same peace, the peace of the justified, the long, quiet ease of those who have done their part and can now let the river carry them. The Nile flows on, the stars wheel overhead, The sand holds its ancient secrets, and somewhere, on the west bank of the river, in the dry hills where the kings sleep, the desert listens, as it has always listened, as it will always listen. Good night. Before the final dark gathers fully tonight, one more story. A small one, told not in the language of kings and battles, but in the language of a single ordinary life. Among the papyrus documents, preserved in Egyptian collections, is a letter written by a man named Hekanacht. He lived during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 4,000 years ago, and he was a farmer who owned land near Thebes. He was away from home on a journey, managing the estate of a deceased dignitary on whose behalf he was performing mortuary rites, and he wrote home to his family several times during his absence. These letters, found in the tomb of a vizier, are remarkable for how unremarkably human they are. Hekanacht is worried about his fields. He gives detailed instructions about which plots should be irrigated and which should be left fallow. He is concerned about the family's rations in a period of famine and calculates precisely how much grain each family member should receive, adjusting for whether they are working hard or not. He is anxious about a servant woman who has been mistreated by someone in his household. He is, in short, a man managing complex family and business affairs from a distance, in a state of some anxiety about whether things are being handled properly in his absence. He also, in one of the letters, defends his choice of a second wife, whom his children apparently resent. He writes, with some heat, that they should treat her well, that she is his wife and deserves respect, and that if they do not behave properly toward her, he will be very displeased. The tone is unmistakably that of a man who has had this argument before and is tired of it. Hekanacht has been dead for 4,000 years. His fields are buried under centuries of Nile silt. His second wife, whose name we do not know, is also long gone. His children, who resented her, are gone. The world he lived in is gone in every practical sense, and yet his voice is here. His worry about the irrigation is here. His exasperation about the family politics is here. His love for his wife, however complicated, is here. This is what the ancient Egyptians gave us, in the end. Not just the pyramids, not just the gold, not just the elaborate cosmology of gods and afterlives. They gave us themselves, their ordinary selves, the selves that worried and loved and planned and hoped and argued and made do and kept going. The selves that are recognizable across every distance of culture and time and belief. We are not so different from them. We too lie awake sometimes, worrying about the fields. We too love people who complicate our lives. We too hope that what we make and do and leave behind will matter, will last, will reach someone on the other side of all the time that separates us. They reached us. That is enough for tonight. Close your eyes now. Let the great, slow river of time carry you gently down into sleep, into the darkness that is also a kind of waiting, into the rest that is also a kind of preparation. The sun will rise again. It always has. It always will. Good night. There is a final thing worth saying about how the Egyptians understood time itself, because it shapes everything else about them, and it is, I think, one of the most beautiful ideas any civilization has ever produced. The Egyptians had two words for time. The first was neher, which referred to the cyclical, repeating time of the sun and the seasons and the flood, the time of eternal recurrence, the great wheel that turns and turns. The second was Djet, which referred to the unchanging, permanent time of eternity, the time in which the dead exist, fixed and complete. These two kinds of time were not in conflict. They were complementary. The living moved through neher, the turning time, always subject to change and cycle and return. The dead existed in Jet, the permanent time, where everything was finished and complete and nothing more needed to happen. The goal of Egyptian civilization was, in a sense, to build a bridge between the two, to create, in this world of change and cycle, things that would endure in the permanent world of eternity, to carve in stone what would otherwise pass away, to speak through the centuries to people who would not be born for millennia. This is what the Egyptians were doing when they built their pyramids and carved their inscriptions and painted their tombs. They were not merely serving their kings or their gods, though they were doing that too. They were attempting to reach across the boundary between neher and Djet, between the turning world and the permanent world, between the living and the dead. They were writing letters to the future, and we are the ones reading them. You are, right now, in this moment, the future they were writing to. The quiet person in the dark, at the end of the day, letting the story of 3,000 years wash over you and carry you towards sleep. They could not have imagined you specifically, but they imagined something like you. Someone who would find the stone and read the words and feel, across all that distance, something real. They sent this forward. You received it. The circle is complete. Sleep now, in the time that turns. Dream, in the time that endures. And wake again, as the sun wakes, as the river rises, as Egypt always somehow woke and rose again. Good night, and thank you for being here.